when I say go to a cocktail party and tell people about what they do, they look at me funny. I try to figure out why they look at me funny. Why, to me, that looked completely natural. I mean, if you think about why you have two hands, or why you have this position for brain cancer, innateness there seems like a, completely plausible hypothesis. Why is it the case that when we think about syntax and innate knowledge, why that cannot be innate? Why it's only having two hands that can be innate? So to me, that seemed obvious, but it turns out that people don't think that this is obvious at all, and they thought that, in fact, even posing the question of innate knowledge is kind of absurd.
What is human nature? It's a question that's troubled scientists and philosophers forever. But Professor Iris Berent, in her book The Blind Storyteller, asks a different question. She asks how lay people think about human nature. Lay people, normal people, people who aren't scientists or philosophers, reason about human nature in systematic ways. She is professor of cognitive psychology at Northeastern University and the head of the Language and Mind Lab. She works in linguistics, specifically phonology. We talk about problems in language, phonology, and her central thesis in The Blind Storyteller here. This is my conversation with Professor Iris Berent. I think the best place to start is talking about the nativist empiricist division in linguistics, just what it's about and where it's at today and what your thoughts on it are.
The question of whether experience plays a role in language acquisition is a no-brainer. Obviously it does, right? So nobody would debate that, infants are not born speaking French, although some people, I think, they do, right? But that's not the case. So the role of experience is indisputable. The question is whether experience is sufficient to explain why it's the case that every human child naturally acquires a language, whereas, say, a cat or a dog that is exposed to the same input would not be able to do so. The nativist alternative here is nuance. The claim is not merely that the advantage of the child arises from something that is innate, because obviously innate capacities include sensory motor capacities. So, for example, maybe the child can acquire English because they can coordinate the dancing of their mouth and lips in an exquisite way, in the way that a cat cannot do. Maybe they just have excellent hearing. Maybe they're interested in other humans. But the nativist position here states that it's not merely innate sensory motor or cognitive generic capacities that are innate, but rather what a child is endowed with innately, critically, is innate knowledge. So a child can acquire a language because they have this advantage, because they are born knowing certain stuff about language, certain very general principles, general rules of language, and it's this innate knowledge that allows the child to acquire language. And it's that position, so obviously here Chomsky, who originated this position in modern time, connects to the big debate in philosophy about the origins of knowledge and takes a very clear position that it's really this rationalist perspective that allows the child to attain language. And I think this is a super interesting way for scientists to connect to this debate in very concrete ways.
Right. In sort of the early formulations that Chomsky had, I think he often said that the empiricist alternative in Skinner at that time kind of doesn't posit a language faculty. It just sees language as a behavior that's produced by a more general cognitive capacity, namely learning.
So in the Skinnerian alternative, that the division between the two positions was extremely large. It was a division between a representationalist plus nativist position versus one that has no cognitive representations at all and no innate knowledge. thanks to Chomsky's work, we have passed into the cognitive revolution. Now people do maintain, at least many people, not everybody, we can talk about embodied cognition later, but most cognitive science does assume the existence of some cognitive representations. And the debate is not whether representations arise, but for the most part, how they arise. So I'm sorry, the debate, I misspoke. The debate is not whether those representations exist, but rather about how they arise and whether there is an innate basis for them.
Right. Right. And just to clarify on that, the idea that there is nativist structure that has knowledge is different from saying that there's a mechanism that has knowledge, right? Like it genuinely has some content to that knowledge.
Exactly. So Fodor, in his modularity of mind, cached this notion of innate knowledge and argued that in addition to claiming innate knowledge, there must be a mechanism that must be postulated in order to explain how this whole thing computes. But for both Chomsky and Fodor, there is this commitment to innate knowledge, because what makes a module, what makes them language module is not simply the fact that it applies to language, but rather it's that innate set of principles that makes it domain specific.
So it has some innateness within it, innate knowledge within it.
Innate knowledge, exactly.
So let's talk about phonology. How did you come to work on phonology?
So phonology is not a really popular place to explore the question of universal grammar. Chomsky himself, when he talks about universal grammar, about UG, typically talks about syntax as the core of the language faculty. And phonology is usually delegated to those as sensory motor capacities, to this externalization. That's not the core of the language capacity. I got to that personally pretty much by accident through my previous interest in reading, and through seeing the very intimate connections between reading and language via phonology, which suggested to me that there is something more basic about phonological computations. And from that, I got very curious about, is there none, how does your knowledge of phonology arise? So maybe we should say something about what phonology is, right? So phonology, as I view it, is your capacity or your knowledge about how, say, words are formed from meaningless elements. So this is your knowledge about how meaningless elements combine to form meaningful elements. Usually those meaningless elements are speech sounds in spoken languages, but not necessarily so. Sign languages exist. They too comprise signs from meaningless elements that are manual. The human capacity for language applies in both modalities, and therefore, to give a more general definition, I'm using this meaningless term, but really this is because language is not modality specific. So that gives you a clue into this notion that phonology is not just about talking, and it's not just about hearing, it's more abstract computation, and that's exactly is the question that I'm interested in my work.
It's really tough to wrap your brain around that phonology applies to not just spoken language, but to sign language as well.
Yeah, because I think that when we think about language, we feel like we are experts in language already, right? We speak a language and we think we understand how we do it. And so we have this intuitive theory about how language works. And we are convinced that phonology, right? So how those meaningless elements combine. Why is it that you blog and you don't lbog, L-B-O-G? So why is it the case that one and not the other? And your intuition is immediately, it has to do with the fact that I just can't say it, right? That book is impossible to say. There is a grain of truth in that, but only a grain of truth. It's only a grain of truth because there are languages that will bog all day long and they have no problems with that. So we now talk in the news about the city of Lvov, right? So that there's no problem for speakers of Ukraine to produce this cluster, the Lva thing. So it's not impossible for the human mouth to produce, but maybe it is more difficult. And the tricky thing about this phonology is that there is this correlation between what phonological systems like to do. So most languages do not ba. Most languages blah. So there is a correlation between what languages like to do and what is easier for the sensory motor systems to do. And then the question is, what's the chicken and egg, right? What is the causation? Is the cause of language patterns, is it caused directly by the sensory motor system? Namely, is it the case that when I come to think about what's possible in my language, it's my mouth and ears that are doing the causal work? Or is it the case that I still have rules of language and I still have universal grammar? And perhaps in, early evolutionary history, that these constraints were shaped by the sensory motor system. But what is now for me and you doing the causal work is those abstract rules. So, in a way, phonology is the least plausible place to look at universal grammar because you have such a strong alternative that is not computational, that is based on simply the body, let's call it. And I think this makes it a really exciting and tough problem to tackle, and one that, unfortunately, most people who do generative linguistics have kind of pretty much gave up on.
Yeah, but that's very exciting that if we're finding abstract rules in phonology, then that's a whole lot of credibility for generative linguistics.
Yeah, it's not easy to show, but I think we do have some evidence that that might be the case. Yeah. And maybe I can, if you'd like, I can go into some of the evidence.
Please, yes.
Why we think that's the case. So for me, it's totally an empirical question, right? We don't know a priori what is the right cause. There are several ways to look at that. One is to test this intuitive psychology explanation of linguistics, which says it's the sensory motor system. So, right, if you think that a dog is bad, it's because you're trying to kind of, even if you're not explicitly talking, you are simulating what it would be to say it, and you can say blah, and you can't say blah, and therefore blah is the better candidate. Well, there's a way to test this, and one way that we have done is to literally disrupt the motor system. So there is this technique that is called transcranial magnetic stimulation, whereby you apply electric current through a magnetic, you disrupt the electric activity in the brain through a magnetic field that is applied on the head, so it's non-invasive. And you can apply it at specific areas, such as the area that controls the lips, and ask, if I disrupt the lips, is it going to disrupt my ability to distinguish between phonological patterns? The idea being that if phonology is only about articulation, then when you mess with articulation, you should mess with phonological knowledge. It turns out that you don't, right? So when you disrupt this, what we have found is that people are just as sensitive to these distinctions. Another way to look at that is ask, what happens when you look at newborns who don't talk? Do they care about it? And it turns out that newborn brains, you can also look at brain activity in newborns through a technique that's called near-infrared spectroscopy. When that study was done, what we found is that, in fact, like adults, newborns who still obviously cannot talk still prefer the good guys to the bad guys. So they prefer the blah type sequences to the blah type sequences. In recent work in my lab, we kind of took even a more audacious approach to this question. And what we asked is the following question. What happens when you override the sensory motor system altogether? So what happens when we present you in phonology not in your familiar sensory motor channel through speech, but through signs in the manual and visual modality? So our intuition is that as non-signer, if you're going to see signs in American Sign Language, this is going to look like dance to you, and it's not going to invoke any linguistic intuitions whatsoever. But this is actually an empirical question that can be investigated. Now, to clarify, I'm not saying that sign language is not a language. All to the contrary, it is a language like any other language. However, if your rules of language are really abstract, then once they recognize a pattern, then the pattern might be recognized regardless of whether it's implemented in speech or in signs. So, for example, if your language has reduplicative structures like ba, ba, and da, da, and you know something about their morphology, about how sound corresponds to meaning. If you're going to see the same structures implemented in signs, where the sign, I'm not a signer, but it's going to be something like, two repeated signs, which would be two syllables like that, would that tickle what you know about the rules of reduplication in your spoken language? Well, it turns out that it does, because if your language has a lot of reduplication like Hebrew, you're going to respond to that differently to English speakers, and also differently to Chinese that does have no, say, plural morphology to speak of whatsoever. So what we find is consistently that what you know about your spoken language actually informs how you respond to signs. So I think this gives credence to this notion that what you know about phonology is extremely abstract and, in fact, a model. It's not linked to any particular modality.
Right. That's very exciting. Very, very exciting. Yeah, just to take a step back, I imagine that's I know there's a problem when we're looking at language in distinguishing between like a national language that's been set there because of rules that are dictated by historical, political, social circumstance versus looking at language biologically. And imagine that's also a problem with sign language as well.
So I think it's an empirical question, right? It's the question of, if you're going to invent language, and it's going to violate every rule of universal grammar, what would happen? And if universal grammar really exists, then speakers ought to not be able to learn this language. Alternatively, languages are born all the time, right, including sign languages. So we know that when deaf individuals are assembled together in a social group and they want to communicate, they will generate language anew. And when those, and the reason why we call them languages is because when you inspect how they work, you see that they recapitulate the structure of other languages, both spoken and signs. So that gives credence to this notion that when languages are generated, they recapitulate this same innate structure. But this is an empirical, question to be looked at.
Okay, just to talk about the embryology of language a little bit, because I think that could be helpful to people not familiar with it. Embryology development obviously plays a part in not just language, but any cognitive phenomena.
Right.
Right. So, how's the right way to think about that? I've heard you say before that we should think about it as triggers that facilitate the development of a language faculty rather than as learning. Is that kind of a helpful characterization?
I don't think we are there. I think that you're asking an excellent question, but I don't think we are there. I don't think so. I can totally understand how, if you're interested in questions about innateness, you want to cash it out in terms of what's the evolutionary story, what's the embryonic story about how this unfolds. So just as you want to understand how the hands unfold in the embryo, so you want to understand how universal grammar unfolds in the embryo. The problem is that we are not there. We are not there. So to have a story about development, evolution, in the species evolution and in the individual in embryonic development, you need to have a sense of what is the anatomy of the faculty and how it is implemented in the brain, and we don't. We have very partial understanding of where things are in the brain, partial, which is very different to understanding of how things compute in the brain. So if we don't understand that, we can't understand how things develop either at a physiological level. So I think you're totally right to hold the science accountable for those questions, but we are, many years away from answering them at the moment.
That makes sense. I mean, I feel like that's the normal story of science, right? You have these different levels of analysis, a computational level of analysis and a physiological one. And if we're just waiting around to make them unified, then we'd never get anywhere. We need to work with the data and the tools that we have.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, although I agree with you that that ought to be a goal to aspire.
Yeah. The evolution of language, as far as I've been able to make it out, seems to be totally mysterious still.
In my reading of the literature too, yeah. I think that that's a perfectly, if a researcher finds considerations about evolution helpful in generating testable hypotheses, then fine. How you come up with your hypothesis, nobody, it's your business. The proof is in the pudding, right? So we want to look at the hypothesis. That's the real question. Using evolution as of course, that would be nice if you can explain that as well, but I think that the ultimate test remains the empirical test.
So, sorry, one thing I wanted to ask you about is the idea of core knowledge. So how should we think about core knowledge?
So core knowledge is a concept that was proposed by Elizabeth Spelke and Susan Carey, both at Harvard. Alan Leslie also suggesting that humans are born with certain innate knowledge in specific domains. For example, infants have innate knowledge of an object, what objects are and how they behave. So if you take newborn infants and you present them with impossible physical events where there's one object and another one comes and bumps into that, but rather than creating a movement immediately, it's like it bumps into that, it stays a second, and then it moves. Infants are demonstrably surprised, including newborn infants are demonstrably surprised by that. Experiments such as that with appropriate controls, which I haven't described, suggest that infants come to the world knowing in advance what objects are and how they behave. They have other expectations about agents. They know that people, if they saw me sitting here and I would stand up and walk, they wouldn't be as surprised as an object because they know that people can initiate a movement autonomously based on their goals. So this is one example where infants apparently are born with a certain innate disposition, knowledge about what objects are. Infants also have innate knowledge about number. They, in fact, can recognize small numerosity. They know the difference between 2 and 3. They have understanding about, as I said, agents and the minds of others is the cause of their actions. So all those are examples of systems of core knowledge. Language can be viewed as one of those systems, and that is an interesting way to formulate the language hypothesis. What it gives you, in addition to what Chomsky is saying, is that core knowledge systems are known to not only define the initial understanding of the world, but also later understanding. So take number cognition, for instance. You and I have a notion of number that is recursive. So we know 1, 2, 3, million and one, right? So you can always have the x plus 1 function that can apply recursively and infinitively. This is not the case for infants. So infant can understand the distinction between 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 precisely, but that's pretty much where it ends. And beyond that, the distinction, say, between 10 and 11 is not possible. You can distinguish 10 from 20, but not 10 from 11. We can do so because we have a novel system, novel in evolutionary terms, of recursive number. This is built on, based on those systems of core knowledge. So the hypothesis that Carey and Spelke spelled out is that the brain forms those novel systems of core knowledge by building upon those systems, that the brain forms those novel systems of knowledge by building upon those earlier systems of core knowledge. The question is whether this also applies to language, and in particular to phonology. And one hypothesis that I think there is evidence for is that the link with what phonology is doing for say adult cognition is giving you the basis for reading and for writing, and those are examples of novel systems that are not universal, that are not innate. But when human brains come to invent those things, they do not just start from thin air, but that rather they build this knowledge upon those systems of core knowledge.
So reading and writing are directly related to phonology.
Yeah, and there is evidence for that. So that's, for example, when you proofread your papers, homophones are the really hard things to proofread, right? So if you have ROSE, ROSE, or ROWS, those are the errors that are really difficult to catch. Why? Because your code of that, the way your brain decodes those things, is not just as the letters, but also as the sounds. Because those two things have exactly the same sounds, they are extremely confusable, more so than two words that would only differ in terms of their spelling. There's a very large literature that shows that that's in fact the case.
So why core knowledge matters for phonology?
Why core knowledge matters for phonology is because in addition to this theoretical question of how we build knowledge and how knowledge arises and whether it is constrained by innate knowledge, it turns out that it might well be the case. There are practical implications that relate to how you teach reading or how you understand dyslexia. And so if it's the case that in order for you to decode words, you need to extract their phonology, then you better teach children how to do that, because this is not something that they would do naturally. Reading is not something that kids would do unless they are taught how to do so. And there is a huge debate in educational communities about what is the best way to teach reading. Finding that adults recognize words by extracting their phonology means, as I said, that this is something that needs to be taught to kids. And when this process goes awry, as in the case of dyslexia, then reading disability indeed arises. So, yeah.
I see. Okay, so we teach grammar, syntax, semantics because we have an implicit assumption that there is something abstract, universal going on there, but we don't think the same way about phonology, and then that's sort of a disservice to education. That's the idea?
No, so we don't need to teach. That's an interesting point that you raised. So we don't need to teach it. So you don't need to teach syntax to a child. A child will acquire syntax naturally and tacitly. This is tacit core knowledge that the child will extract. Why? Because language is a natural capacity in humans. Reading is not. A child will learn language and will get its phonology even when they're not taught explicitly. Illiterate people do just fine. Their linguistic capacity is completely intact. They don't know how to read, though. Reading is not the same as language. Reading is it's an invention. It's an artificial system. Think about it. How crazy is it that you expect a child to see those scribbles on a piece of paper and link it to language, right? This is not natural for humans to do. So this is an invented capacity. So precisely because it's invented, the instinct is to think about it as, it can go either way. You can just teach the letters and the words will come up. But it's precisely because you understand that the system runs on the tracks of the language system. And in order for reading to work, it needs to connect to language in the same way that speech connects to language through phonology, that things have to go in this particular way. That is exactly because reading recapitulates your knowledge of language, and because language necessarily entails phonology, that's also the case that reading is built on phonology. And for it to work properly, when it comes to reading, unlike language, here you need to teach the child how to do that, because otherwise they won't be able to extract phonological structure spontaneously. So yeah, so language and reading are linked by this, but distinct, and it's precisely core knowledge that explains this distinction.
Okay, I think I get it now, yes. Just because you don't need to teach children to speak because it's not invented, it's a natural capacity they have. But because reading and writing are invented, that link is needed.
Yeah, they're invented, but they're not arbitrary, and that's the trick there. Yeah.
Right. They're a human capacity that have deep roots to our cognitive capacities.
Yeah.
Coming back to embodied cognition, you mentioned earlier, I'm really confused in this area. The sort of overlap between what embodied cognition says about generative linguistics. Do you mind just briefly sort of introducing that?
Sure. So embodied cognition is the claim that your understanding of, say, concepts is based not on some abstract representation, but it directly is based on the sum of your sensory and motor interactions with the relevant entities. So my understanding of this battle, I don't have this abstract symbol for a battle, but rather it's the sum of my experiences holding the battle, how cold it is and how round it is and how metallic it is. This is what counts as my understanding of the battle. Furthermore, when I perceive a battle, so in order for me to really retrieve this sum of experiences, I need to simulate what it would be for me to actually hold this. So to connect to the example of phonology that we used before, embodied cognition would tell you that your understanding of why blah is better, it's not some abstract rule, it's not this abstract representation, but rather you are trying to simulate, to enact what it would be for you to say blog. You do it silently, but you nonetheless go run this tape, so to speak. And it's this experience, embodied experience, that informs your, say, phonological intuitions in this case. So this is really an alternative to the representational theory of mind. What the cause of your, say, linguistic intuitions is not structured representation. It's not the structure of my representation of the word. Rather, it's the sensory and motor of experience of, in this case, producing this sound sequence. There is a little bit of a red herring there, actually a very big red herring there. So when you say cognition is embodied, obviously that sounds great. What would be the alternative? That cognition is disembodied, that you're a dualist, that if you believe in, say, abstract rules, then do you think that they do not form part of a body? Obviously, that's not the case. The alternative that, say, a generative linguist would suggest is not that knowledge of language is somewhere in the air, but it's in the brain, which is part of the body. So the debate here is not between an embodied view and some ethereal view, but rather two views of how information is represented in the body. One that claims that information is represented in terms of abstract symbols in the brain, and the other suggests that the brain mechanisms operate by simulating motor plans or say, sensory plans, and it's that constitutes your representation of reality.
So generative linguistics is still, well, embodied in the sense that your brain is part of your body.
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, and that's problematic because oftentimes, that's a draw. So I want to make it clear. I do work in my lab that look very seriously at the notion of embodied cognition, and we do have evidence for embodied cognition. So I think that some of those claims are right in a very particular domain that I can explain later. So I have, nothing against embodied cognition. I do have something against the alternative that if you endorse the role of abstract rules, then you're a dualist, which is a claim that you often hear. I don't think that follows at all. So in particular, say what we do in the lab is show, so there's a huge literature, for example, it's a super interesting literature that shows that when you perceive a speech sound, I'll remain in the domain of language for a moment. When you perceive a speech sound such as ba, a sound that is produced by the lips, the motor area of the brain that controls the lip fires. When you hear a sound like da, that's produced by the tongue, another area adjacent that controls the tongue, that area fires. So there is direct support, and furthermore, we know that if you stimulate those areas using transcranial magnetic stimulation, you're going to affect perception. So not only do we know that hearing a sound simulates this motor but rather the role of this motor plan is causal, that if you disrupt it, then you really disrupt perception. So there's very strong evidence that in the perception of speech sounds, people do rely on embodied cognition, just as the theory suggests. This, however, does not mean that all aspects of language are embodied. It does not demonstrate that, say, when you compute the sound sequence, you only rely on embodied cognition. And in fact, we have found, as I demonstrated, that when you disrupt the same lip motor area, you do nothing to the perception of syllable structure, for instance. So I think this is in line with the hypothesis that there are some low level of language, say, think about language as a Lego factory, right? What language is doing is constructing these beautiful towers out of discrete units using combinatorial rules. But before you do that, you need to get the Lego blocks, right? You need a Lego factory that gets that Lego units from the analog, continuous plastic stuff. That process is heavily embodied. And that process, when causally critically relies on the activity of the motor system. But at least based on the evidence that we have so far, it remains quite possible that there are other aspects of language that the combinatorial department of the Lego factory, this relies on abstract rules. So I think there is room for both, and I think there is a really interesting research program ahead to try to really define specifically what each of them does.
Right. So you think then embodied cognition can help explain what those Legos are,
and how they are extracted? Yes. The thing is that it's often the case in science that people like to have strong hypotheses, and they have a hypothesis and they want to push it as far as they can and to say, okay, I've shown evidence for embodied cognition in one area, the perception of speech sounds, therefore language is embodied as a whole. And I think the answer is more nuanced. I think that that very strong hypothesis is probably not correct.
Okay. So shifting gears a little bit, we can talk about the blind storyteller. So how did you become interested in this question of what lay people think about human nature?
As a mechanism of humanity. So I became interested in that because so most of my career, I was interested in universal grammar and question of innateness, of innate knowledge. It was my impression that when I say go to a cocktail party and tell people about what they do, they look at me funny. I tried to figure out why they look at me funny. Why, to me, that looked completely natural. I mean, if you think about why you have two hands, or why you have this position for brain cancer, innateness there seems like a, completely plausible hypothesis. Why is it the case that when we think about syntax and innate knowledge, why that cannot be innate? Why it's only having two hands that can be innate? So to me, that seemed obvious, but it turns out that people don't think that this is obvious at all, and they thought that in fact even posing the question of innate knowledge is kind of absurd. It took me a while to kind of figure that that's really what's going on, And once I did, I figured, okay, let's find out, right? I'm a cognitive scientist. I have the tools to examine that. So let's see if people are in fact biased in this way, right? So the first thing is to test my intuitions. I think that they're looking at me funny. Is it really the case, right? Is it really the case that people think that knowledge cannot be innate? And if so, why that's the case? So I started running a few experiments. It turns out that that was the case. And I decided, okay, I need to write a book.
Right. Okay. So what are the findings? How are people systematically misled about human nature?
Right. So again, I think that this is a huge accusation, right? That this is a huge bill to pause here. And this is particularly difficult to demonstrate precisely because scientists also debate on this question, right? So if you ask scientists, some of them will say there is no such thing as innate knowledge. So how do you go about that? So two ways. One way we went about that is simply focus on the facts. So present people with experiments, say with newborns. What newborns can and cannot do, these are facts. And then you can ask lay people to predict what would happen in these experiments and see what they would tell you and see whether people are systematically biased about what they think can and cannot be innate in newborn infants. And there you just have large body of evidence that you can contrast their intuitions with, what actually happens. So when you do so, people will tell you that, yes, newborn infants can, say, differentiate happy from sad faces, that facial emotions are innate. They have no problem with that. They think that, say, the capacity to sit and walk, even though the infant is not doing it right now, that is also innate. But when you ask them, will the infant understand that objects cannot move spontaneously, or that would they have a notion of numbers? So would they know that 3 lights and 3 sounds have a property, numeric property in common? And you tell them exactly how it was done. So you actually repeat the experiment as it was done and ask them to predict, what do you think infants would do? And then they tell you, no way. So when you ask people about sensory capacities about emotions, they volunteer that emotions, facial emotions, are innate. In fact, that's not the case. I should clarify. What's not the case is it's not the case that newborn infants can recognize facial emotions. At least so far, we have no evidence for that. Maybe facial emotions are innate. I think there is good reason to think that's the case, but recognition of facial emotions, that's not a scientific fact. But people are convinced that that is a fact. But when you ask them about innate knowledge, or at least the ability to recognize abstract number at birth, we know that infants can do that. People say that's not the case. So this is your first red light. Now, there might be other reasons about why people don't think that knowledge is innate. Maybe it's because they learned math at school and they think that everything that has to do with knowledge has to be learned. That might contribute, but it does not explain what's going on. And it doesn't explain what's going on because when you look at why people are doing what they're doing, how they arrive at this decision, you see that the principles that drive their conclusions are completely messed up. And it's this faulty logic that makes you think that they are actually biased. So even if we don't ultimately know the answer about innateness, we still can show that the way people approach this problem is biased and is faulty.
Right. Just anecdotally, I completely find that to be the case. People always think emotions are innate.
Yeah.
They have a really tough time accepting that emotions can be learned. Whereas on the other hand, they have a really, really tough time thinking knowledge can be innate. Like, to convince someone that you have numerosity as a capacity is really, really hard. People just don't accept it.
Yeah. So that's exactly what the experiments show.
Yeah. Okay. So then we can. So you talk about intuitive dualism and intuitive essentialism. So those are two kinds of camps that we can organize those findings under.
Yeah, so my claim is that our faulty conclusion arises from, it's kind of a perfect storm. So when we think about when people reasoning is guided by various set of principles that have very good reasons to exist. They have core knowledge of objects. They have core knowledge about the mind of other, and the two are distinct. So that gives rise to this notion of minds and bodies are separate. That gives rise to intuitive dualism, and there is a large evidence that people, in fact, are intuitive dualists. So that's one thing. People are also essentialist in the sense that they think that living things are what they are because there is some essence that they are born with. A dog is what is a dog because it's born with some doggy essence that it possesses. And there is further evidence that when people think about this essence, they believe it resides in the body of that creature.
Right.
Okay? So the literature about dualism and essentialism, there are two very large literatures that show that people are intuitive dualists and they are intuitive essentialists. What has not been previously recognized is that these two principles actually stand in conflict to each other. And they stand in conflict because when you come to reason about innateness, essentialism is talking and it's telling you, in order to figure out what's innate, you need to look at the body because the essence is in the body. But dualism tells you that knowledge isn't in the body. Knowledge is in the mind. That's what dualism is all about. So it follows from the collision between these two principles that knowledge cannot be innate. That's kind of the insight of the blind storyteller. And when we went to the lab and tested this model, it turns out that actually it is borne out by the results that that people are in fact when they reason about knowledge, they view it as ethereal, distinct from the body, more so than, say, emotions. That when people think about innateness, they think that what's innate must be in the body. And there was also evidence that those two principles interact. So I think there is good reason to think that the reason for our conclusions about what can and cannot be innate, they arise from these two principles of intuitive psychology. And that's really is the problem, right? Because this notion that knowledge is ethereal is obviously not in line with science. Essentialism also has some difficulties as a scientific doctrine, at least when it comes to explaining evolution. So it's the collision between these two principles is representing faulty ways of inference, and that's really what leads us astray when we think about innateness.
Evolution specifically, this might kind of just be a dumb question, but evolution specifically, do you think that sort of the people knowing the conventions of evolution might contribute to them thinking of the body differently from the mind? Because I mean, to me, it's equally scientifically amazing that genes lead to bodily development as it is how language works in the mind, right? But the public education isn't there, where people know a little bit about how evolution works, but not a whole lot about how the brain works. Do you think that's kind of contributing at all?
Let me see if I understand. So you're saying that maybe the reason why people don't get innateness is because they understand evolution, but they don't understand the brain?
No, just I'm talking about the specific idea of how people reason differently about the body and the mind.
Or how that idea arises, whether it has evolutionary origins?
Exactly, where people might use their sort of baseline understandings of evolution to reason one way about the body, and then the lack of baseline understandings about the mind to reason differently about the mind.
Well, you would only do so if you're a dualist, right? So it's because you're a dualist that you think about that the mind must obey different principles from the body. So indeed, you can understand evolution, but on top of that, you're a dualist, you would exactly arrive at that conclusion. So it I think it implements this distinction rather than provides an alternative to it.
Right. People start at dualism. Okay.
Yeah. But I just want to clarify, I don't think that dualism per se is an evolutionary product, right? So I don't see any good reason for evolution to distinguish between bodies and mind. Rather, it's kind of, as I call it, a series of unfortunate events, in the sense that, yes, evolution has interest in giving organisms the capacity to recognize objects, say the body of their mothers. Evolution might also have interest in giving humans the capacity to reason about the minds of others. That might be adaptive. Each of those capacities are adaptive. Together, they give us to dualism, but dualism itself has absolutely no...
I see. So those are both adaptive in their own right. It's just the unfortunate accident of having them both.
Yeah, exactly.
That leads to people thinking this way. That's really smart. Okay. The impact of this is you talk about how people incorrectly reason about mental disorders.
Yeah, among other things, right. So the whole notion of mental disorders, I was always wondering, what are people talking about when they talk about mental disorder, and is it physical or is it mental? I mean, what could it possibly mean? What am I not understanding here? It turns out that this dualism actually also kind of is the heart of how people reason about mental disorders, unfortunately. So, at the beginning of this century, or actually the end of the 20th century, there was this attempt to, let's educate the public. Let's try to fight stigma there's a lot of stigma, obviously, concerning mental disorders. Let's try to fight the stigma by telling people, listen, this is a physical problem like all other problems. And in fact, it did not fight the stigma, and it did not abolish the stigma in some ways. So there are really mixed results. There are some results that suggest that if you believe that a person's disease is caused by their body, they are not freely willing the symptoms, then perhaps they're not responsible for them. On the other hand, if their body is so different to yours that they include this innate disorder, then maybe you don't want to marry them, and maybe, right? So you distance from them. So the question, but we try to understand a little more why that's the case, that invoking the brain. So the question was whether it's specifically this notion of invoking the brain that actually caused the stigma. So we did experiments such as telling people that here is this person that have symptoms of depression, and they come to the clinic, and they're getting a test for to diagnose them, and the test either looks at their behavior, so through some behavioral procedure, say how you respond to happy faces versus sad faces, and look at how fast people respond pressing a button, or look at some brain wave that happens in response to the same procedure. So the information that you get in both cases is exactly the same, and people are told in both cases, if you respond, say, faster to happy faces, then we know you don't have depression. If you don't, you do. The results, people are told, are exactly the same. The information that's obtained by the same test is exactly the same. But then when you ask people, why is the person like that? Were they born this way? Would you like to have your sister marry them? And so forth. They tell you that when the result, when the result is obtained by the brain test, then people are more likely to think that the disorder is innate, and they also are more, they have more stigma. They are less likely to accept this person as, say, a marriage partner, and so forth. This is only explained by dualism, right? Because why would you interpret the brain results differently from behavioral results when they're informatively exactly equivalent? It looks like people attribute to the brain first, they consider the brain different to information that does not speak to the body directly. And furthermore, perhaps because they're essentialists, they think that if it's in the brain, it therefore going to speak to your essence. And therefore, you better, not marry this person and right. Kind of, yeah. So, and that's very unfortunate. I mean, that's extremely a serious and concerning result.
Yeah, I mean, mental disorders, it's such a broad term. We don't know what to include in the umbrella of it. But is there sort of homogeneity there where people think the same way about, say, dyslexia as they do about dementia? Or
yeah, no, they don't.
They don't.
Okay. So there are several distinctions to draw there. First, among those, the ones that people usually consider the real mental disorders, say people don't think about dyslexia as a mental disorder, a psychiatric disorder, even though technically it is, but they think about, say, depression as a mental disorder, schizophrenia as a mental disorder, and people treat them differently to dyslexia. Dyslexia, we actually, you get the opposite result. So when you ask people about dyslexia, they typically think that, you ask a person why Johnny has problems reading, the 6-year-old, they tell you, oh, it's all letter confusion, they skip letters. That's actually not factually correct. So letter confusions happen to young children across the board, regardless of whether or not they have the dyslexia. The characteristics of dyslexia, what defines dyslexia, well, I should step back and say dyslexia is very heterogeneous. There are many types of dyslexia with many origins, but in most cases, what you find most frequently are problems with processing speech sounds. So it's not in vision, it's not in, our intuition says that dyslexia is all a visual problem, but in fact, the problems that you see in dyslexia, because remember, the link to the language and how this is hijacking the brain pathways for speech and language. The problems actually are in speech processing. And in fact, you find them if you look at infants who are at risk for dyslexia because their parents, dyslexia runs in families. So if you look at very young infants whose families have dyslexia, their speech perception is already significantly different to controls. But lay people don't think that's the case. So either they think that if they think that dyslexia is really a serious disorder, then think it must be visual because only sensory capacities can be innate. Right. Whereas if you tell them what dyslexia really is, which is really a problem in decoding sound letters, they think, oh, this might be this ethereal thing that is that cannot be really innate because it's not in the body and therefore it's not as serious. So the misconceptions about dyslexia and, say, depression are opposite. In depression, people run to the conclusion that because you can you think it shows up in the face and because it's emotional, it must be innate and in the body. Whereas in dyslexia, as soon as you think about what it really is, which has to do with mapping letters to sounds and knowledge, then you think, oh, that must be something that's completely, learned and not something that's innate.
I see. What about something like schizophrenia?
So schizophrenia, we found the same results, although because the disease is so severe, there, people tend to think about it regardless of how you present them as innate, but when you look at them, manipulate this with a more sensitive procedure, as we did, you do find the same findings.
So then, if telling the public that it's all physical didn't really work out, what is the kind of right way to be communicating this?
So maybe we don't know. Yeah. I think it's an empirical question what works. But if I had to guess, I would say perhaps making people aware of their biases, know themselves, right? Maybe that would bring some insight, hopefully, but it remains to be seen.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit. Just want to ask you about this idea. So the idea in psychology that different languages lead people to think differently. So I've kind of been confused about that. So what is the sort of linguistics perspective on it? Because from a linguistics perspective, it seems that there's generative language and it's largely the same across the species. So how could it express so differently?
So it's an empirical question, right? There are people who worked in different, there are scholars who worked in different areas of language who came with different claims about that. So rather than, I don't think what matters is not what is the official position, but rather how does the literature look like when you look at that. One thing that I think is really important to kind of get completely to a red herring that we need to clear up ahead is this notion of what thinking is, right? So I think that part of the problem arises because people think that thinking is in language, and therefore if you have different languages, it follows that you must think differently. But that's actually not the case. So we already talked about a lot of evidence that suggests that newborns, in fact, can think. They have a notion of number, they have a notion of object, they have rudimentary understanding of language. So thinking does not require language. And in fact, most of thinking happens completely under the hood. So our intuitive understanding of thinking is it's the kind of the dialogue that you hold with yourself, which is linguistic and in fact involves probably phonology, as the linguist Ray Jackanoff suggested. So it stands to reason that if you have no language, you can't hold this dialogue. But cognition, the science of cognition, tells us that most thinking happens completely, the most interesting things happen under the hood completely, and they're not accessible to language and they're not accessible to this internal dialogue. So therefore, to hold those computations, you don't need language, and indeed there is a lot of literature that suggests that there are many aspects of cognition that can happen very well without recourse to language.
Right.
This being established, we can now turn to the question of, okay, so what happens when you do have language and when your language differs from mine? There are tons of experiments that suggest that there are all kinds of subtle differences that happen. But, so for example, if you have different color words than my color words, then your performance on certain color tasks is going to be different to mine. How important is it? Or to give another example, if you speak Japanese, where in Japanese I'm told that when there is an incident that happens, and if I drop a cup, didn't mean to do that, then you won't mention who did it. Well, there's evidence that when you look at present videos of incidents like that to Japanese speakers, they have slightly worse difficulty recognizing who did it compared to English speakers who would speak about it in these terms. So the evidence is there, but what it really means, I leave it up to you. I think it would be preposterous to claim that if you're a Japanese speaker, you don't have a sense of morality or of free will or responsibility just because you speak this way, and there is a difference of, say, 3 or 4% in your ability to recognize. So yes, there is a measurable difference in performance, but I don't think these are profound differences in cognition.
Right.
There are other cases, however. So this being said, there are other cases where not having certain linguistic categories can make profound difference. Number cognition is one of those cases. So we talked about how the capacity to have recursive number is something that you build upon core knowledge that you're born with. What allows you to build this inventive mechanism of recursive number? Well, there is evidence that having number words in your language, having a language that talks about number or have mechanisms such as plurals is important for this capacity to emerge. And there is beautiful work that suggests that if you have languages, if you have speakers of languages without those devices, then they don't develop recursive number. even if, so there was the initial demonstration by Peter Gordon that looked at members of the Piraha, which are hunter-gatherers in the Amazon, that showed that they don't have recursive number. You can say, well, maybe they're not interested in number. Maybe it's their culture that causes them to do so. But subsequent work looked at home signers, speakers who are deaf and communicate using signs, but not a sign language. So they don't have linguistic formal mechanisms to express number. They have all the societal initiative to understand number because they engage in commerce and so forth, and still they don't acquire recursive number. So I think there is pretty strong evidence that if you don't have numeric language, then number cognition, recursive number cognition doesn't arise. And I think this is a huge deal. So there are few cases where number really has this profound effect on thinking. The hypothesis is not false, but this needs to be really looked at in a very nuanced way.
Final question. Do you have any advice for young people?
Follow your dream. Think really hard. So first, I'd say academia is difficult, right? If you're going to go into that, it's because you really want to do that and you really care about it. Otherwise, don't bother because it's way too hard and difficult. But if you like those things, then think on your own. Read a lot. Balance practicality with reaching to the stars. So you want to make your mark and reach to the star and go to those big questions. You also want to have something cooking that would allow you to fall back to. So it's like everything else in life. Have good friends that you can talk to and balance the difficulties of academia. But go for it. Yeah, there are so many questions that need people, smart young people that need to go there.